Well, thank you. And this is going to be an ongoing series of talks where we integrate science and faith. And I'm the president of Reasons to Believe. It's an organization we founded 30 years ago. We're headquartered not too many miles from here, a place called Covina, California. And if you look in the center of your table, you'll see a card that looks like this. And what you'll see there is a brief summary of what we consider to be the best scientific evidences for the God of the Bible. So you can take that with you and read it and then think of someone you can give that to. And there's also a place for you to give us your contact information. And if you do that over there at our table, they'll give you a free DVD. This DVD where I'm interviewed about science faith issues, and then I field questions from people on a variety of science faith topics. And again, that's a great tool to give to someone who is interested in seeing what the Christian faith is all about. Now, I have a PhD in astronomy, and you heard that I got into astronomy when I was young. I started when I was 7 years of age. That's when I began reading about 5 books on physics and astronomy every week. And I'm going to focus on one subdiscipline of astronomy tonight, cosmology. And so these are going to be some cosmic reasons to believe in Jesus Christ as Creator, Lord, and Savior. And here's an outline. I'm going to first talk to you about what cosmology has got to say, establishing that God is transcendent, that the universe tells us there must be some causal agent beyond space and time that created the universe. And then the evidence from astronomy that this transcendent entity is actually a personal, loving God. And finally, what is the evidence from astronomy and physics that we're looking at a God that wants to redeem billions of human beings? Now, the first book I ever read in cosmology was at age 7. And it was a book by Sir Fred Hoyle titled Nature of the Universe. And as I was reading through that book, I realized that Fred was very bitter towards the Christian faith. I mean, he just kind of spewed out venom page after page. But one of the things he did say about the Bible is this quote: "There's a good deal of cosmology in the Bible. It is a remarkable conception." And as I continued to study astronomy as I was growing up, by age 16, I became convinced because of astronomy that the universe had to have a beginning. And if there's a beginning, there must be a beginner. And starting at age 17, I began to look for that beginner in the different great philosophical works and the holy books of the religions of the world. And when I got into the holy books, I discovered what Fred said back there indeed was correct, that the Bible has more than 10 times as much to say about the origin and history of the universe as all the rest of the world's holy books combined. Now, one of the things it says repeatedly, and this is something I think everybody knows, no matter where I go around the world to speak, everybody is aware that the Bible makes this claim that the universe has a beginning. And not just any kind of beginning, but a beginning of all physical reality. The very first verse in the Bible, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." Now, in Hebrew, there is no word for universe, but there's this phrase, Shamayan Ares, with the definite articles, the heavens and the earth. You'll see it 9 times in the Old Testament, and it always refers to the totality of physical reality, all matter, all energy, and all space and time. And if you go into the New Testament, you'll actually see some passages explicitly speaks about God's activities before the beginning of time. And this is what's really unique to the Bible compared to the other holy books. In the Eastern religions, for example, they talk about God or gods or forces creating within space and time that eternally exists. The Bible, by contrast, says that space and time do not exist until God creates the universe. Hebrews 11:3, the universe that we detect did not come from that which we can detect. And we can detect matter, energy, space, and time. Or you can go to passages like Titus 1:2. The hope we share in Jesus Christ was given to us before the beginning of time. Or 2 Timothy 1:9, the grace of God that we now experience was put into effect before the beginning of time. Now, I was reading the Bible seriously for the first time at age 17 when physicists in Britain were developing the first of the space-time theorems. And today, over 30 of these theorems have been published. And with each theorem, the theorems have gotten more and more potent. And the power of these space-time theorems is that they're fundamentally based on just two assumptions. Assumption number one, we live in a universe with mass. And as I look out at each one of you is living evidence that the universe contains mass. A couple of you a little more so than others. The second assumption is the equations of general relativity reliably describe the movements of bodies in the universe. Now, how many of you recall what happened last February? A huge announcement. They discovered gravity waves. That was the last prediction of general relativity to be put to the test. But since February, general relativity ranks as the most exhaustively tested and best proven principle in all of physics. In terms of how reliably it describes the movements of bodies in the universe, it does it to better than 15 places of the decimal, which means there's no basis for doubting that the universe contains mass. There's no basis for doubting that general relativity reliably describes the movements of bodies in the universe. If those two things are true, then what follows is this statement. Matter of fact, I've got the paper right here if you care to read it. Inflationary spacetimes are not past incomplete. For those of you who are fans of tensor calculus, you're just going to eat this thing right up. Incredible paper. But it ends with a statement that everyone can understand. The conclusion of this theorem is that any universe that expands, and only a universe that expands, will allow for the existence of life. Any universe that expands has a space-time beginning, which implies that there must be a causal agent outside of space and time who creates our universe of space, time, matter, and energy. Now you'll notice the three authors there, Borde, Vilenkin, and Guth. After this paper was published, Alexander Vilenkin wrote a book on the implications of these theorems. And this is what he wrote in his book, Many Worlds in One. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. And what is that problem? Proof of a space-time beginning implies a causal agent beyond space and time who creates our universe of space, time, matter, and energy. In other words, a transcendent God must exist. Now, if you read the latest books being published by atheist physicists and astronomers, they won't use the word God. It's causal agent beyond space and time that brings the universe into existence. But last time I checked my dictionary, that's a rather good definition for the God of the Bible. And what you notice in the latest books being put out by these atheist physicists and astronomers, they're now conceding this point. So even Lawrence Krauss, for example, in his book, A Universe from Nothing, concedes that a deistic worldview cannot be avoided. And it's because of the force of these space-time theorems. And so the battle, theologically, in physics and astronomy, has shifted from whether or not there's this agent beyond space and time that creates everything to whether or not this agent is a personal being. So that's where the debate has shifted. A transcendent God must exist, but is this God personal, and did he design the universe and the earth for the redemption of billions of human beings? So having established my first point, we're going to go into points 2 and 3. Now, as much as the Bible says about the beginning of the universe, it actually has much more to say about the expansion of the universe. Now, I'm not only an astronomer, I'm also a pastor. I've been a pastor for a few decades, and as I speak in churches, I'm amazed at how few people in the pews realize the Bible makes this statement about the expansion of the universe. You won't find it in Genesis. In fact, it's not in any of the books of Moses, but it is in the oldest book of the Bible. In the book of Job, chapter 9, verse 8, it says, God alone expands the universe. Now that's a literal interpretation. What most of your English Bibles will say, God alone stretches out the heavens. But the verb natah in Hebrew means the expansion of what's being described. And these are all the texts that speak about the expansion of the universe. Now, reading this at age 17, and having studied astronomy since I was 7, I realized that the Bible had stood alone in making the statement that we live in an expanding universe. It stood alone until the 20th century. So up until the 20th century, only the Bible, amongst all the books of science, philosophy, and theology, were stating that we live in an expanding universe. It wasn't until George Lemaitre came along in 1925 and used Einstein's theory of general relativity to say the universe must be expanding. But the Bible had been stating that for thousands of years previously. Now, I've written a whole book, The Creator and the Cosmos, detailing the most compelling scientific proofs that we live in an expanding universe. I don't have time to give you that. I'm not going to give you the best proof, but I'll give you a visual one. And it's thanks to the Hubble Space Telescope. So what you see in the left is a shot of galaxies located 12 billion light years away, which means it took the light 12 billion years to travel through space to reach our telescope. So we're looking at galaxies 12 billion years ago. Contrasted with a different part of the universe, where we're looking at galaxies that are only 2 billion years ago. And I put both of these images to the same spatial scale. So what you can see is over the course of 10 billion years, the galaxies have spread apart from one another as a result of the universe expanding. So on the left-hand slide, you see galaxies jammed so tightly together, they're tearing spiral arms off one another. But as you move forward 10 billion years, the galaxies have now expanded apart from one another, where this is now a rare phenomenon. And that was a huge factor in my giving my life to Christ. I didn't really get to know a Christian till I was 27. That's because I was educated in Canada. Christians are much harder to find there than they are here in Orange County. But it was a discovery that the Bible actually had predicted this character of the universe thousands of years ahead of its time. Now, today we know what is the factor that most controls the expansion of the universe. Something that was only discovered in 1999, dark energy. How many of you here have heard of dark energy? Okay, about half of you have heard of dark energy. It makes up 3/4 of all the stuff of the universe. It's the dominant component of the universe. It's the energy that's embedded in the space surface of the universe. And the way that dark energy operates, as the universe expands and as the surface gets bigger and bigger, dark energy becomes progressively more powerful in its capacity to accelerate the expansion of the universe. So, for example, for the last half of the history of the universe, the space surface has been expanding faster and faster and faster. Now, if you expand the space surface of the universe too slowly from the cosmic creation event, gravity will collect all the gas of the universe and compress it into nothing but black holes and neutron stars, where the minimum density is 2 billion tons per level teaspoonful, at density so extreme that molecules are not possible, atoms are not possible, not even protons and electrons are possible, and of course life would be impossible. However, if you expand the universe too rapidly from the cosmic creation event, gravity will not be able to collect any of the gas to make galaxies, stars, and planets. And if the universe is forever nothing but dispersed gas, once again, life is impossible. And when dark energy was discovered back in 1999, a number of my colleagues calculated to what degree do you have to fine-tune design dark energy so that life is possible. And the problem is you go to expand the universe at just the right rate, at just the right time in the history of the universe, excuse me, in order to get the planets on which life would be conceivably possible. And what they discovered is you have to fine-tune dark energy to 1 part in 10 to the 122nd power. That's 122 zeros after the 1. I mean, to give you a point of comparison, there's only 10 to the 79 protons and neutrons in the entire observable universe. We're talking about something that's more fine-tuned than someone picking out by random chance one marked proton out of all the protons that exist in the universe. But what I've done in my books is to give you a way you can visualize this without having to think about those big numbers. And that is to think about what is the best example of human fine-tuning design. And I could take you back to February. Those gravity waves were discovered by an amazingly designed gravity wave telescope, an instrument so well designed it can make measurements over 4 kilometers to within better than 1/10 the diameter of a proton. By far the best machine we human beings have ever invented, designed, and built. However, if we compare the fine-tuning design of the best example of human achievement to dark energy, we recognize that the fine-tuning design in dark energy needed to make life possible is 10 to the 97 times superior to the best example of human engineering, creativity, and design. Now that implies that the one that designed this dark energy to make our existence possible, at a minimum, is 10 to the 97 times more intelligent and more knowledgeable than the Caltech and MIT physicists who invented and designed this instrument. Now, I spent 5 years at Caltech. I worked with these guys. They're not dumb. They're brilliant people. But the one that designed dark energy is at least 10 trillion times more intelligent and more knowledgeable. Or I could put it another way, at least that many times better funded than the U.S. government that made it possible for these telescopes to be put in operation. And I think you can see where I'm going with this. We're not only talking about a causal agent that transcends space and time in creating the universe and setting up the physics of the universe. This is not just an entity, it's a being, because only a personal being can manifest the attributes of intellect, knowledge, power, and creativity, and manifesting it to a level far beyond what we see claimed in the gods of the other religions of the world. The fine-tuning design exceeds the best human design success by at least 10 to the 97 times. Now, I think you would expect someone like myself, I'm a Christian astrophysicist, you'd say, well, of course you would be drawing conclusions like this. But what's interesting is that even those who take an atheistic worldview perspective amongst my peer group are drawing similar conclusions. In fact, once this fine-tuning was recognized and dark energy was beginning to be measured, this paper was published titled Disturbing Implications of a Cosmological Constant, published by 3 atheist theoretical physicists. And when the paper was published, the senior physics editor of the British journal Nature interviewed the 3 authors, Philip Ball, and Philip Ball himself is an atheist physicist. And this is what these 3 theoretical physicists said when they were interviewed by Philip Ball. First, arranging the universe as we think it is arranged, say the team, would have required a miracle. Now, that's a remarkable statement for 3 atheist theoretical physicists to make. But they went on to say, an unknown agent, namely beyond space and time, intervened in the evolution, that is the history of the universe, for reasons of its own, which explains the title of their paper, Disturbing Implications. They found it so utterly disturbing that if dark energy is real, there must be this agent beyond space and time performing miracles for reasons of his own, that they concluded this paper with this final sentence. This is the last sentence in the paper. Perhaps the only reasonable conclusion is that we do not live in a world that is a universe with a true cosmological constant. Cosmological constant is another term for dark energy. Now, the irony of this paper is it was published just months before astronomers came up with 9 independent observational demonstrations that not only is dark energy real, it's the dominant component of the universe. And if you go to our reasons.org website, you'll see 9 short articles, about a page each, that I've written showing you these observational demonstrations that indeed dark energy is real and the dominant component of the universe. In fact, if you go to that URL on the bottom of the slide, you'll actually see that today we have 25 astronomical demonstrations that dark energy is real and is a dominant component of the universe. In other words, dark energy is here to stay. It is a dominant component of the universe. There's no basis for doubting that anymore, which means there's no basis for doubting that there must be this agent beyond space and time who's performing miracles for reasons of his own. So it's not just those of us who are Christians who are drawing the conclusion that the causal agent is a personal being. Even atheists opposed to the Christian faith are drawing that conclusion. Now, if you were to ask me as a scientist, where do you find the most spectacular evidence for fine-tuning design? I would say dark energy. It's the most spectacular one that we can measure, but it's not the only one. Virtually every feature of the universe and every feature of the laws of physics shows a very high level of fine-tuning design to make life possible. So, for example, all the forces of physics must be exquisitely fine-tuned. I mean, you have to fine-tune the force of gravity relative to the force of electromagnetism to better than 1 part in 10,000 trillion in order to have stable burning stars. If it's not fine-tuned to at least that degree, stars will either never form in the history of the universe, or they'll form and they'll instantly explode. Either way, life is not possible. And the list goes on. As I say, virtually every feature of the universe and of the laws of physics shows this high fine-tuning design. By the way, the C there stands for carbon-based life. That's the only assumption I bring to bear here, is that life must be based on carbon. And that was something that was recognized 40 years ago, that the only element in the periodic table that gives you the chemical bonding complexity and bonding stability to make life possible is carbon. You can't make life out of arsenic or silicon. It's got to be carbon-based. Now, it tells us repeatedly in the book of Job and the book of Psalms that the more we examine nature, the more evidence we'll see for the handiwork of God. Or what you see in the Psalms, that God has given us 2 books, the book of nature and the book of Scripture. And the book of nature establishes, just like the book of Scripture, that there must be a God with the personal attributes we see described in the Bible. So it reasons to believe, all the way back in 1991, we decided to put this to the test. And what we would do is survey the scientific literature and discover which characteristics have been found that show this high degree of fine-tuning design. And so back in 1991, the list stood at 17 different features showing this high level of fine-tuning design. But look at how the list has grown since that time. Today the list stands at over 200 different features of the universe and the laws of physics that must be fine-tuned to make life possible. You can go to that URL at the bottom, reasons.org/fine-tuning, and you'll see the documentation and the citations to the literature. The compendium there is about 300 pages long. It's 300 pages long because we've taken it one step further. I mean, if you were to go to, I'm sure there's a campus bookstore here, go to any university campus bookstore, you will find about 50 books on what's called the Entropic Principle. The Entropic Principle is the concept that the universe in which we live has been designed to make life possible. as the agnostic physicist Paul Davies wrote in his book, The Cosmic Blueprint, we see overwhelming evidence in the universe that has been designed to make life possible. But that's where these books typically stop. They stop at the level of the universe. What's unique to us at Reasons to Believe, we've taken it one step further. Excuse me. Based on what we read in the Bible, if we see this fine-tuning design at the level of the whole universe, we would expect to see it at every cosmic scale level. So we've asked the question, what about the cluster of galaxies in which we live? What about our galaxy? And we discover, for example, is that over 200 different features of our galaxy show this level of fine-tuning design. No matter what scale you look at, from the universe as a whole, to our galaxy, to our planetary system, to the surface of the Earth, all the way down to fundamental particles, we do indeed see this accumulating evidence for design. It is such, and you'll see this at reasons.org/fine-tuning, the evidence for fine-tuning design by the God of the Bible gets approximately a factor of 1,000,000 times stronger per month. So when I'm on university campuses like this, I can share with skeptics, if you're not convinced today, wait 1 month. And let's see what the advancing scientific literature will show us. Freeman Dyson put it this way in his book, Disturbing the Universe. Well-known physicist, describes himself sometimes as an agnostic, other times as a non-theist, and he writes, the more I examine the universe, the more evidence I find that the universe in some sense must have known we were coming. And whatever physicists and astronomers have interacted with, they would agree, indeed, with Freeman Dyson, that you can't escape the conclusion. It's all been designed in advance for the appearance of life, and the level of fine-tuning design is orders of magnitude greater if you're talking advanced life. Now, it not only knew we were coming, when you actually look carefully at the characteristics of the universe, it knew that there was a God that had put into effect a plan to bring about the redemption of billions of human beings. You actually see this repeatedly in the Bible. Here's one example. Romans 8. The entire creation groans, subject to the law of decay. Romans tells us that the whole universe has been subjected to this pervasive law of decay. Everywhere you look in the universe, we see the evidence of decay. Hey, all you got to do is look around you, look at one another, and you can see ongoing evidence of decay. All right, I'm probably one of the prime examples up here. Those of you who are under 25, it won't take long before you actually see advancing decay taking place in your bodies. It's everywhere. But notice what this text says. This law of decay will remain in effect until the full number of human beings that God intends to bring into a redemptive relationship with himself has been reached. That tells me that there must be something about this second law of thermodynamics, this law of decay, that's critical to redeem human beings. And what you actually note, this is not only true just of the second law of thermodynamics, it's true of every law of physics. Each of the laws of physics has been designed to make possible the redemption of human beings. Now, let me get into what's going on with the law of decay. I'll just take that one example, but I've written a book where I take you through the other laws of physics. What we notice about the law of decay is designed so as not to discourage us from performing productive work. Yes, we live in a universe with a very high rate of decay. I'll give you an example. I'm not a fan of doing yard work. One reason why I'm not a fan of doing yard work, I can spend 4 hours on a Saturday getting our yard looking the way my wife wants it to look. 10 days later, I got to do it all over again. The law of decay just, it's there. But fortunately, I got 10 days. What if the law of decay was so high that I would spend 4 hours and then 1 hour later, it looked just like it did at the beginning of those 4 hours? Nobody would do any work. But God made sure that the law of decay operated in such a way as not to discourage us from productive work. Yes, things decay, but they take time to decay. But we also note that the decay rate is not so low as to let our evil and sin go without consequences. Now, Genesis chapter 3, there's a story there of Adam and Eve being in a paradisical garden. But God told them that they needed to obey his instructions and told them there would be consequences if they did disobey. They chose to disobey. And so God spoke to them and said, because you've now chosen to enter into a lifestyle of performing evil acts, from now on, in proportion to the evil you commit, you'll experience more pain, more work, and more wasted time. Now, some of you who are professors here probably realize this. Students don't like to waste time. They don't like extra work. They don't like extra pain. And so that kind of is a motivating factor for them to perform well in your classrooms. It's also a motivating factor for all of us to avoid any kind of sin and evil, because if we pursue a pathway of sin and evil, we're going to experience more pain, more work, and more wasted time as we try to undo the consequences of our sin and evil. And the way we're biologically designed, the way the laws of physics are set up, none of us enjoys extra work, wasted time, or more pain. And by the way, that's really the best way to discipline. I would argue that the best way to deal with criminals is to incarcerate them in such a way that they experience more pain, more work, and more wasted time. In fact, I remember teaching my sons about this as they were growing up, saying, you know, if I don't discipline you, the laws of physics will, and you're going to experience these consequences. And they told me many years later that the greatest pain they experienced was listening to my talk about the second law of thermodynamics. And what these laws of physics are really designed to do is show you the consequences of your sin and evil, but also show you that you can't overcome your propensity to sin and evil without God's help. In other words, the harder you try to live a virtuous life and avoid evil, the more you discover you can't do it. But as we look at the universe, we see a universe that obviously testifies of a very powerful and very intelligent and knowledgeable creator. And you look at everything he's provided on our behalf, the extravagance of what we have here on planet Earth to care for our needs. We realize this is a God that cares for us, that loves us. And he's written a law upon our hearts. And the way that law operates is that the slightest infraction against him, the slightest sin that we commit, our conscience reacts and tells us that we're falling short of God's standard of moral perfection. And it was Job who said, I can't do it, but I know that my Redeemer lives. I have an advocate, and if I depend upon that advocate and Redeemer, then he will do for me what I can't do for myself. He didn't have a Bible, but he had the laws of physics, and he had the universe that showed him that pathway. Now, I described this in a lot more detail in this book, Why the Universe is the Way It Is. It's over there at the table. But before I open up for Q&A, let me close with a story. I travel a lot in my speaking, and there was one time I was sitting at an airport and our plane was delayed. And they called my name. And that's never a good thing when they call your name. It usually means you're going to get bumped off the plane. But instead they said, Mr. Ross, do you mind if we put you in first class? And I said, well, I think I can handle that. And they sat me at the front of the plane, and this gentleman sat down beside me, and he also was a gentleman who never flies first class. But he said, I'm consulting for Microsoft, and they insisted on flying me first class. And he says, by the way, I'm a quantum physicist. I'm from Germany, I'm an atheist, and I'm a skeptic. Well, it's really rare that someone who's a total stranger introduces himself to me right away as a skeptic and an atheist. And he says, well, who are you? And I says, well, I'm not a quantum physicist, I'm an astrophysicist. And I'm not from Germany, I'm from Canada. And I'm not a skeptic or an atheist, I'm a Christian. And he said, this is going to be a very interesting flight. And so as we sat down, he said, I got about 8 questions I want to ask you. Well, it was a fairly long flight. We got through all 8 of his questions. And he asked me questions like, well, if there's a God, why is the universe so big? I mean, why do you need 200 billion galaxies? And he said, if there's a God, why does it have to be 14 billion years old? Well, he kept asking questions like, ask me the question, why this enormous rate of decay? So we talked about that. And then he said, how come you know the answers to my questions so well? And I said, well, every question you ask me is a chapter in a book I wrote, Why the Universe is the Way It Is. And he said, you got to be kidding. Well, I had a copy in my briefcase. So he opened up to the table of contents and says, you're right. My questions are all right here as chapter titles in your book. And I said, well, you're not the first person that's asked me these questions. I said, you are the first person that asked me all of them. As we walked to baggage claim, he calculated the probability that a German quantum physicist who's an atheist would be spending 2 hours on an airplane with an astrophysicist who is a Christian. And he told me the probability is much less than 1 chance in a billion. And as we continued to walk to baggage claim, he said, I know what happened today is not an accident. And for those of you who are followers of Jesus Christ, I want to close with 1 Peter 3:15. Always be ready with good reasons for the hope within you, and share those reasons with gentleness, respect, and a clear conscience. And if you commit yourself to be prepared with good reasons, and commit yourself to deliver them with a Christian demeanor, you will see God supernaturally bringing people across your path to hear those reasons. If I had time, I could share with you hundreds of stories, just like what happened with that German quantum physicist. And many times it's led to people coming to faith in Jesus Christ. Every one of you can have that experience. First, by giving your life to Christ, and then just saying, I'm going to prepare good reasons. And that's what I did when I signed my name in the back of a Gideon Bible. I didn't know any Christians, but I realized after studying the Bible for 18 months, the Christian life is a life of being a public witness for Jesus Christ. And if I'm going to be a public witness, I have to be prepared. Always be ready to give good reasons for the hope within you with gentleness, respect, and a clear conscience. One more thing I'll share with you. Just one story. Then we'll wrap it up. I got to speak at Caltech a few years back at the International Skeptic Society Conference. So these were skeptics and atheists from all over the world, 700 of them, that spent a weekend at Caltech. So I attended the whole conference, and there were 6 speakers, scientists from around the world, that came and talked about the scientific evidence for no God existing. And at the very end, they had me debate Victor Stenger, a particle physicist and an atheist. And we have the debate over there at the table. And what you're going to see in that DVD is basically the same message I gave you tonight. But you get to see how it goes over with an audience of 700 well-educated atheists and skeptics. And I got to talk to a lot of them after the debate. You know what the most common comment was I got? We have never heard a scientific defense of the Christian faith before. If you Christians have got this evidence, why haven't you been talking about it? They simply presumed that we Christians do not have a scientific case because they'd never heard one. They said, we've gone to lots of debates, but this is the first time that we heard a scientific defense. And so I just encourage you, maybe you're not a scientist, but maybe you can find someone that you can give these resources to, simply just to show them the scientific goods are on the side of the Christian faith. With that, I want to close and open it up to questions. And by the way, I will take any question. It doesn't have to be on the subject matter tonight. The only rule I'm going to have is if you've got 3 questions, I'm going to ask you to take 3 separate turns because I want to involve as many people as possible. So, thank you.
Thank you for your lecture. I'm curious how this specifies Christianity and not any of the other Abrahamic faiths like Islam or Judaism. How do you go from astronomical God exists and prove this to Christianity is the reason and not maybe Islam or Judaism?
Well, that's a good question. And, I would look at Mormonism, Islam, Judaism, Christian Science, Jehovah's Witness. I call them Christian cults in the sense that the Bible is a core part of their religious system, but they add or subtract to the Bible in a way that denies the fundamental teachings of the Bible. And one of the common denominators of all these Christian cults, every one of them denies the existence of a triune being as the God of the universe, a God that's three persons and one essence. And so something that you'll see in why the universe is the way it is, science only makes sense from a triune God perspective. So one of the critiques I would have, say, with both Judaism and Islam, how do you explain the origin of love in God's creatures? Love, by definition, requires another person to exist to express that love to or receive love from. And if God is simply a single personal entity, then that entity has no capacity to express love or receive love. So the problem with both Islam and Judaism is they have no answer for why in the universe we have loving creatures. In fact, my colleague Ken Samples and I, we had a 2.5-hour debate with two Jewish scholars. And they were talking our ears off. We couldn't get a word in edgewise. But finally we managed to jump in. How do you explain love if God is simply strictly monotheistic? And utter silence. They had no answer. Now, I would also critique the Eastern faith, because in the Eastern faith there are many gods. But these are gods that all have different creation plans. So for example, what you see in Hinduism and Buddhism is this anticipation that in science we're going to have inconsistencies and contradictions as a direct result of many gods being involved in the creation plan. Now, if God is three persons and one essence, what that one essence means is they all have the same mind. They all have the same goals. They all have the same purposes. And so from Christianity's perspective, you'd anticipate that the study of nature will reveal total harmony and consistency and freedom from contradiction. And you may be aware that in India, there's a tremendous move from Hinduism to Christianity. Why? Because so many people in India are now studying engineering and science and mathematics, and recognizing through what they study, this does not fit our Hindu upbringing. And therefore they're seeing Christianity as being the faith that is really consistent with what they're learning in engineering and science. Back here.
Can you tell us that portion of your spiritual journey in which you compared the different holy books to science?
Yes, I mean, you heard my story, how I started studying science seriously when I was 7. And by the way, another part of that story is that my parents were worried that I was being compulsive about astronomy and physics. So when I was 10, they bought me this big, thick book on evolutionary biology. And I was the only one in the family that read it. But I told my parents, Mom, Dad, the numbers don't add up. We have all this speciation before humanity and very little afterwards. And it was when I picked up the Bible, it answered for me the fossil record enigma. For 6 days God creates. On the 7th day he stops creating. And 3 times in the Bible, John 5, Psalm 95, and Hebrews 4, it tells us we're still in the 7th day. The 7th day is when God stops creating and begins redeeming. And when the redemption has been complete, he will create again. Revelation 21 and 22. But what reason for the fossil evidence, for 6 periods of time, God creates species of life. On the 7th day, he stops doing that. We're in the 7th day right now. And when I looked at the different holy books, religions of the world, simply looking at the astronomy and nothing else, I realized that the Hindu scriptures basically taught a reincarnating universe theory, an oscillating universe where there's multiple beginnings, not just one beginning, where there's a very low measure of entropy, not a high measure. and recognized when I read that at age 17, that can't possibly be correct. And then I looked at the Quran, and it talks about how there's these 7 layers that make up the heavens. The problem, however, is they put the stars closer than the planets. And also I figured this had to be written by a man, because it said the gestation period for the human female was 6 months, not 9 months. So, you accumulate enough errors like that, you realize this can't be from the one that created everything. And when I picked up the Bible finally, I realized after a 2-year study, this is a book that contains no provable errors or contradictions. Definitely passages I don't understand, but no provable errors or contradictions. And it was the only holy book I picked up that actually predicted future scientific discoveries, and did it hundreds of times. In fact, what brought me to faith in Christ, I was 19 years of age, I was a sophomore physics student, and our professor assigned us the problem of calculating the probability that one of us would be killed by a sudden reversal of the second law of thermodynamics. And it's not that difficult of a problem. So for example, in this auditorium, there are quadrillions of air molecules, and trillions of them are below the freezing point of water. There's actually a tiny possibility that those molecules below the freezing point of water will wander in the vicinity of this young lady over here and freeze her to death. That could happen. 1 chance in 10 to the 80th that it could happen. A possibility that's so extremely remote, we're confident that has never happened anytime, anywhere in the history of the universe. But as I went through over 200 different places where the Bible predicted future scientific discoveries, I realized the probability of that happening without divine miraculous inspiration was less than 1 chance in 10 to the 300th power, which meant I just demonstrated that the Bible is 10 to the 220 times more reliable than the second law of thermodynamics. And since I'm gambling my life, trusting my life every second on the reliability of the second law, it would be irrational for me to put even greater trust in the message of the Bible. And that's what motivated me to sign my name in the back of this Gideon Bible when I was 19 years of age. By the way, I'm old enough that I got one of these in a public school. When I graduated from grade 6, the Gideons came into our public school and made available a Bible for each one of us. I didn't read it or touch it until I was 17. And after 2 years of studying it, signed my name in the back, committing my life to Jesus Christ. Over here.
How did your colleagues go about calculating the probability of untuning dark energy?
Well, if you expand it too quickly from the cosmic creation event, then gas is all you get. Now, gravity won't be able to collect the matter to make stars and galaxies. And if you expand it too slowly, all you get is really big stars that quickly evolve into black holes and neutron stars. And so they calculated, and what they determined was you actually have to have the universe expanding slower when it's young and faster when it's old. Because not only do you need certain kinds of stars and planets and moons for life to be possible, they have to show up at the right time. So for example, it's crucial that our planet Earth form when the universe is about 9 billion years old. Because when the universe is 9 billion years old, it's maximally abundant in uranium and thorium. And without that abundance of uranium and thorium, our planet couldn't have been transformed from a water world into a planet with oceans and continents on its surface. And so, taking all that into account, they discovered that you have to fine-tune not only the dark energy, you have to fine-tune the mass that's in the universe. Because what I didn't share with you is dark energy is a dominant component governing the expansion of the universe. But there's a second factor, mass. Because the way gravity works, massive bodies attract one another. And so the more mass you have in the universe, the more that gravity is going to tend to slow down the expansion of the universe. And when the universe is small, gravity will dominate dark energy because the space surface is small, the bits and pieces of matter are close together, but as the universe expands, gravity becomes weaker and weaker, in its capacity to slow down the expansion of the universe, while dark energy gets stronger and stronger in its capacity to expand the universe. And to get everything right so that life is possible, you want gravity to be dominant for about the first half of the history of the universe, and dark energy to be dominant during the second half of the history of the universe. So you not only have to fine-tune dark energy, you also have to fine-tune the total mass of the universe. I think you're next, then we'll go to you. Go ahead.
How old do you believe the Earth is, and how do you put that together with the seven-day creation?
Okay, what is the age of the Earth? We know it with very high precision, 4.5662 billion years, plus or minus 0.0001 billion. So we actually know it to 5 places of the decimal. And that's because we can use 6 different radiometric tools to measure it to that high degree of a precision. Now, how do we reconcile that with the 6 days of creation? I was raised in Canada. I didn't really get to meet Christians until I showed up at Caltech. And so I was just reading the Bible on my own. And one thing I noticed, I started in Genesis 1. It talks about these 6 days. I want to know, what is the definition of day? Well, what I realized, without any knowledge of Hebrew, it must have at least 3 distinct literal definitions. Because in creation day 1, it contrasts days and nights. So that's the word day for the daylight hours. On creation day 4, it's seasons, days, and years. So that's day referring to 24 hours. But Genesis 2:4 uses the word day to refer to the entire creation history. So that's the word day referring to a long period of time. Now, if you pick up a Hebrew lexicon, you'll discover there's actually 4 distinct literal definitions. It can mean part of the daylight hours, all the daylight hours, a 24-hour period, or a long but finite period of time. But again, at age 17, it said it's got to be 6 consecutive long periods of time because there's no evening and morning for the 7th day. The first 6 days are bracketed by an evening and a morning. Now again, not knowing Hebrew, it says, I wonder what the evening and morning mean. And it says, well, at a minimum, it's got to mean that each day is a start point and an end point. Those words actually have 3 distinct literal definitions, but that's one that obviously applies. But when you got to the 7th day, there's no evening and morning. You only get an evening and a morning for the first 6 days. And as I read through the rest of the Bible, I realized 3 places beyond Genesis refer to the 7th day as an ongoing event. We're exhorted to live our lives in such a way as to enter into God's 7th day. And then we see at the end of the Bible, Revelation 21 and 22, a day will come when God will create again. But right now, we're in his day of rest. And so that's what persuaded me that these must be 6 consecutive long periods of time, with a long period of time where God redeems billions of human beings, and the new creation to come. The other clue I got was on creation day 6, it says God created both the human male and the human female. But in Genesis 2, it gives us the story of human origins in much more detail, where God creates Adam first, and then he has Adam work the garden long enough to realize there's got to be more to life than gardening. And then he has him name what are called the nephesh animals, the higher animals, the soulish animals. And as you look at the book of Job, what Adam was really doing was examining each of these species of soulish creatures to see how God designed them to serve and please him, gave an appropriate name. But after he'd done with all that, God looked down at Adam and said that he was lonely. And therefore he put him to sleep, performed surgery on him, and as he recovered from his surgery, he was introduced to this new creature, Eve. And the word you see in the original Hebrew coming out of Adam's mouth when he sees Eve, it's the word hapa'am, used over 20 times in the Old Testament, consistently translated at long last, which means day 6, likewise, is a significant passage of time, which means all the days are significant passages of time. And by the way, as I've traveled around the world, it seems like only English language speakers are concerned about this issue. And there's a good reason. You're translating Biblical Hebrew into English. Biblical Hebrew is one of the smallest vocabulary languages that has ever existed. There's only 3,000 words if you don't count the names of people and cities. And you're translating it into by far the largest vocabulary language. English has 4 million words in its vocabulary. So for example, in English, we have over a dozen words for an epoch of time. But in Biblical Hebrew, the only word you got for an epoch of time is the word yom, that's translated day. So Moses had no other way to describe consecutive long periods of time except to use the word day. But hey, if you're interested, over there at the table, I got a book called A Matter of Days, where I give you 19 more biblical reasons why these must be long periods of time and not 24 hours. And you were next.
Could you please share a little bit on Genesis 1, 2, what your thoughts are on the earth was without form, void, and what do you think the deep is?
Very good question. When I looked at Genesis 1, 2, I was really impressed the first time I read it, because I said, what we have in Genesis 1, 2 is step 1 and step 2 of the scientific method. And I was kind of naive. It took me another 9 years before I realized why the Bible so carefully follows what we call the scientific method. The scientific method actually came from the pages of Scripture. So it's no accident that the scientific revolution exploded out of Reformation Europe. And step 1 of that scientific method is, do not interpret until you first establish the frame of reference or the point of view. Step 2, do not interpret until you also establish the starting conditions. Genesis 1, 2. The Spirit of God is hovering over the surface of the waters of planet Earth, which means we're to interpret the 6 days of creation from the perspective of an observer on the surface of the earth looking up at the clouds, not down on the clouds. Then it gives you 4 initial conditions. It says water covered the whole surface of the earth. It was dark on the surface of the waters, and it was formless and void. It was empty of life and unfit for life. But now the Spirit of God begins to work, and He transforms the earth to make it fit for life, and He fills it with life. That's basically the story of Genesis 1. And, one message, in fact, this was what happened when I was there at Caltech with the skeptics, is that they went after Genesis 1. And what I've discovered is most atheists and skeptics insist on interpreting Genesis 1 as if God is up in the heavens looking down on the earth. And if you take that point of view, then I would have to agree with my atheist friends. Genesis 1 is teaching scientific nonsense. But if you put the point of view on the surface of the earth, and with those 4 initial conditions, you get a perfect fit. That was the first thing I noticed about the Bible at age 17. It was the only creation story I'd read in any of the religions or philosophies of the world that got everything right. Everything correctly described and everything in the correct chronological sequence. But if you get the wrong point of view, you get the opposite. It's 100% wrong. Most atheists will tell you the Bible is 100% wrong on creation. It's because they got the wrong point of view. And let me quote Galileo here. In his court trial, he made the comment, the biggest mistake you can make in Bible interpretation is to get the wrong point of view. One more question? Okay, last question. Who wants to be last? Let's see. Go ahead. This gentleman. Yeah, go ahead. This lady right here. Yeah, you'll see a book back there called Navigating Genesis, and the question she's asking is, the formless and void, some people interpret that the earth fell into a ruined condition, and then God had to restore it. It's called the gap theory. And yeah, you'll see a chapter in my book where I deal with the gap theory, basically making the point it was a very popular theory 100 years ago. And there are many versions, but the most popular version is that God kind of set everything up right, and then Satan decided to challenge him, and God says, well, if you think you're so smart, give it a go, and things got really ruined. And then God basically had to patch it back together. There are other versions of the gap theory, but that's the most popular one. But all gap theory interpretations are based on interpreting Genesis 1-2, the world became formless and void, rather than the world was formless and void. Now, my interpretation is that Genesis 1-2 is simply giving you the starting conditions, or the initial conditions. It's not talking about God, quote, restoring something that got ruined. This is just simply the initial conditions of the earth. But the basis for saying the world became formless and void was the assumption that we would find Hebrew manuscripts that would have the verb to be as hayah rather than hayah. If it's hayah, then the world was formless and void. If it's hayah, the world became formless and void. Well, 100 years forward, we found more manuscripts. None of them have hayah. All of them have hayah. So there's no exegetical basis for the gap theory anymore. And I think we're now down to just one theologian that's still promoting the gap theory. Everybody else has abandoned it, simply because of the fact that there's no manuscript evidence to support it. I think there's another reason why it needs to be abandoned. If you look at what the rest of the Bible says about Satan, you notice he's a very powerful being, but he does not have the power to create. Only God has that power to create. That's something you see explicitly stated in Isaiah chapter 40 through 48. So another problem with the gap theory is it attributes powers to Satan that he does not possess. And by the way, we don't possess those powers either. Okay.